Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and welcome to the Wernick Files. And I'm really thrilled to have Brandon Garrett as a guest. Uh, Brandon wrote a book that was published, I think, early 2025. Um, that I read about just about as it came out, and it's a I might not recall the exact title, but it's defending due process. Uh,
Why fairness matters in a polarized world.
the subtitle I didn't remember, but
Yeah, yeah.
so the book really impressed me, and I'm really happy that Brandon has agreed to come on and and we can talk about uh, due process. I think given what people right now about ICE and the detentions, what rights people have and don't have. Um, I don't think most Americans get very much of a decent civics education and the details associated with not only procedural issues, but the whole point of our legal system is the goal is to produce justice. So that's the Madison said basically to paraphrase him that the end of government and the end of civil society is to do justice. So that's the objective function, and law is supposed to be a means to accomplish that. People confuse law with an end in and of itself, but really law is a means to an end, and law is a way we're supposed to accomplish the goal of achieving a just society. So, and one of the procedures when there's a philosophical framework associated with it is due process, and one of the quote procedural issues that was deemed so important, according to John Adams, the American Revolution began when John Adams heard James Otis in a court argue with respect to what we call writs of assistance, and John Adams, listening to James Otis speak, said that that was basically, from at least his perspective, the beginning of the thought process that began the idea of an American Revolution. So this is really an important topic, and I'm fortunate enough to have uh, Brandon on to discuss it. So
Yeah.
Brandon, as that as an introduction,
Thank you.
why don't you explain to people why you thought writing the book was necessary, and
Sure.
in this time of where so many people have expressed so much confusion about people's rights or lack thereof, that seems to be significant confusion about this. Why don't you use this time to help clarify a lot of the confusions so many people seem to have about these issues?
Sure. So I'm Brandon Garrett. I teach at Duke Law School. Uh, I teach procedure. I teach students about the due process clause. Due process rights come up in all kinds of different subjects at law school. It's kind of ingrained for lawyers, but for most of us in our regular lives, like if we're in a meeting, or if we're like, I don't know, we're having dinner with the family, and someone says, like, before we talk about that, let's talk about the process. Everyone's like, kind of be quiet, like, this is annoying. Like, no, I want to talk first. No, I want to talk first. And I mean, sometimes it's like, no, we really do have to decide who's going to talk first and how we're going to fairly decide this, and who's going to pick the movie we're going to watch tonight, and are we going to vote on this? Like, what are the ground rules?
Yeah.
But obviously, like, we all want to be treated fairly by teachers, by family members. We all feel it pretty viscerally if someone treats us unfairly. We all remember, like, as kids, like, and there are a lot of studies about how kids care about the process a lot. Kids don't just care about getting, like, the bigger cookie. Like, if they feel like there was favoritism and who got to choose which cookie they got, like, they will make it known. And we all may remember that, or certainly remember that with our own kids. Or, like, fairness is really ingrained. Some of it is related to equal treatment, but a lot of it is just like, was it fair? Was it biased? Was the teacher refusing to let me go to recess for a reason that made no sense, and everyone else got to go to recess, or whatever it is? We all get procedural fairness. It really matters, though, when it's not just like us and our teachers or in our community or at home or dessert over dinner or whatever, when it's the government. Because the stakes are very different when it's not who got the bigger cookie, but who's going to jail, who gets their car seized, who gets taxed, who gets their house taken. That's very different. And that's what the due process clause is about. The stakes are really different. And we may think it's fine to be rude to someone, to be unfair to someone we don't like. We can't always be polite. We can't always maintain our temper. And our interpersonal reactions, you can be rude to someone and maybe that comes back on you. Maybe it doesn't. It's very different, though, if it's a judge that is just being rude to someone, that's arbitrarily detaining someone just because. Maybe for a moment it feels good for us to just say, I'm not giving you the cookie tonight because. Probably not a good idea to maintain family peace or peace between your children. But, it's not exactly rights that are at stake. Although kids will often make rights-based arguments. Kids are like expert lawyers when it comes to litigating dessert-type issues. Very different, though, when it's the government. And this isn't, we can, I think you're right that, there's been a lot of discussion about due process this year. I wasn't expecting that necessarily. One of the reasons I wrote the book was I was procedural due process rights are very old rights. And in some ways, they've been neglected in the courts. And I wanted to draw attention to ways that due process issues have surfaced around the country and some new research that suggests how we can better protect them. That was why I wrote the book. I didn't think that 2025 was going to be like the year of due process, and 2026 looks to be the same. And that said, I'm teaching like habeas corpus to my students now. That's a right that's as old as due process, maybe older, depending on how you look at it. These old English rights come out of crises that are just as big, just as eventful, maybe more so than anything we're experiencing right now. Anytime you have divisiveness in society, you have crises, you have civil wars, you have wars between countries, anytime you have people who are unpopular, who are seen as a threat, whenever these things happen, and they've happened in very violent ways throughout history, in European history and in our history, anytime these things happen, people need to talk about due process. And so I actually think in some ways it's expected that whenever you have conflict, due process becomes the concept that we all turn to.
I think that linking the two, as you talked about, Brandon, is the link between fairness and due process. I mean, it was the procedural rules we established in order to be fair, because in order to do just, we have to be fair. So then the question is what are the conditions under which we can be fair to all the parties involved? And it seems to me, when we take a look at like the immigration issue, it seems to me some people don't seem to want to. For some reason, people seem to think that if you want to be procedurally fair with immigrants, illegal immigrants or undocumented, however people want to refer to them, is that many people want to be less fair to somebody that crossed the border without proper permissions than they want to be to somebody who might have been accused, who is a citizen of being a serial murderer. So,
although actually we have talk about saying like, if someone's been accused of a serious crime, they shouldn't get a hearing either. They've been accused of a serious crime. They should just be in jail. In every context, there are understandably some people who are just like, this person did something terrible. Why should we have to wait to get all the facts? Why should we have to wait to get them before a judge? We need to take care of this public safety problem right now. And just to back up a little bit, so the due process clause, like the due process isn't just sort of like a phrase, like you're unfair to me, this violates due process. It was referred to in a kind of abstract way in the Declaration of Independence. And actually the Declaration of Independence describes a lot of abuses at the hands of the English monarch that the colonists thought were really unfair. But the Bill of Rights was drafted in large part because of concerns that the Constitution that all the states ratified didn't have adequate protection to the key rights and privileges that people were used to having in England, and they didn't have protections to prevent the kind of abuses that people had seen as subjects of England, because there wasn't a written constitution. There wasn't sort of a statutory Bill of Rights in the English system. Anyway, so we have two due process clauses. Right away in the Bill of Rights in the Fifth Amendment, the language is included because people are really worried about this new federal government. Like, what is this federal government going to be doing? There's this big new federal government. Is it going to abuse our rights? Many states already had due process clauses, and so they weren't as worried about the states at the time. And so the Fifth Amendment due process clause says that a person should not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And so that means if the government is trying to take something important from you, if they're trying life, liberty, or property, life would normally, hopefully, only be in a criminal trial. You're being tried for a capital offense, but there are lots of different ways that you can be deprived of property in civil or criminal ways. Fines, aren't usually criminal. They could be property, by eminent domain or a fine or something like that. So there are lots of things the government can do that can affect your liberty or property, certainly. And then it says, if the government's going to take those things from you, they have to first give you due process of law. Well, what is that? What the courts have described, and this is very much like global. In some parts of the world, they tend to call it fair trial rights, but they don't just mean a trial. They mean, in general, if the government is taking important things from you, like life, liberty, or property, they have to provide a fair process. That's typically described, and all the U.S. courts have described this, same thing around the world, as having three basic elements. If the government is plans to take away your life, liberty, and property, they can't just go ahead and do it normally. They can't just say, we have your car, haha, what do you want to do about it? They have to give you notice first. They have to say, we're planning to seize your car because you have not been, paying your vehicle registration fees in the state or whatever. And if you don't pay, by the time that it is due, we can take certain action like seizing your car. You have to give advance notice with reasons so a person can understand why this is being done. If the notice just says, we're going to take your car because we like it, no. Or because we feel like it, no. But second, you have to have an opportunity to be heard in response. If you think, no, this is unfair, I've been paying my property taxes on time, or I'm indigent, there's an exception, I should be able to pay only what I can afford, there's a sliding scale or whatever your argument is, you should have a chance to get before some kind of a hearing officer, whether it's an actual federal judge or an elected judge or something more informal. Kind of depends on the situation. You should be able to go in front of someone, though, and say, I paid this stuff on time, or I complied with the law. Do not seize my car. It's not right. This should not happen. And then this decision maker should be someone who's impartial. It shouldn't be the local sheriff that wants your car, right? It should be someone independent, someone impartial, who has to give some reasons why they say, no, sheriff, go ahead and take the car. I've reviewed the record. I don't think this person has actually paid their vehicle taxes at all. Or, no, they can't take your car. You're right. You paid on time. You're exempt from some of these because you're indigent, whatever. Some opportunity to get before someone. Normally, you also have the right, if that local magistrate or whatever didn't come out your way, normally there should be some opportunity to appeal, too, to go to a higher judge in case that local judge is biased or got it wrong. But that's in general, notice, some opportunity to be heard in response, some kind of a fair hearing before the government does something momentous. And all of us get that. None of us would want to be in jail just because. We all take for granted, really, that no, if I'm going to be jailed, even if yes, you can jail sometimes people who pose a danger. You can jail them before trial. But you can't jail them without a hearing just because. And you can't take someone's car without a hearing just because. So that's in general what due process requires. And we have a second due process clause where after the Civil War, the concern was, okay, many states do have their own due process clauses, but they've been unevenly enforced. And, there are a lot of concerns about, after the Civil War, with slavery having ended, how would the former slaves be treated? Would they really get the same due process rights? And so in the 14th Amendment, basically the due process clause is repeated. But it says not just the federal government, but states may not deprive people of due process of law. And one important thing, by the way, is that the due process clauses, both of them, refer to persons. They aren't limited to citizens or people of special status. It's like any persons within the U.S. And so it's very broad and intentionally so. Even at the time of the founding, there wasn't this concept of like different types of legal status exactly. There wasn't immigration law in the U.S. There was naturalization to become a citizen, but there was no particular concept. There were certainly persons that were not considered persons because there was slavery. But the idea was that due process rights should be held very broadly. And the 14th Amendment, same thing. Okay, so that's in general how courts have approached due process in this country. But that's sort of the easy thing. The hard question is, well, okay, how fair does that hearing have to be? And how quick does it have to be? And there still can be a tendency, even if you get a hearing, well, what if the judge is really just focused on, I don't know, you look dangerous to me, go to jail. Like, how seriously do judges take due process? And are there sort of end runs that government officials can make to deprive people of these due process rights in ways that are not visible, where we don't always see it happening? And that was a lot of the focus of my book. Like, how is due process, how can it be eroded? Why is it that we still see lots of examples of pretty large-scale systems actually in this country where people can get their liberty and property taken without a lot of recourse? And then third, I talk about ways that technology, and we're seeing this, every week basically, the government is incorporating all kinds of new technology, AI systems and the like. It's one thing if it's a biased judge that doesn't like you or just thinks you're dangerous and says, I'm taking your car, I'm putting you in jail. It's another thing if it's an AI system that says, I don't know, we've looked at this person's digital communications, this person's dangerous, put them in jail. And the judge says, I don't know, the AI says so, I'll do it. So lots of pressures in society, in the courts, and technology. Those are the main three themes of my book.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I like to try and remind people and reinforce with people is that, and I'm glad you brought this point up, is the fact is that when it comes to due process rights, since at the time of the founding and people who want to take the Constitution seriously for what it meant, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution in many respects is a natural law doctrine, in the sense that that's what refers to inalienable rights, is the fact that certain rights we're endowed with by nature, and so therefore they're rights that the government doesn't have any right to interfere with. And so that's the point of the Bill of Rights, is to leave that without a doubt, that there are doubts there are rights that we are endowed with, and there are rights that the government, except under maybe very limited circumstances, can't do, are not allowed to interfere with at all. And it doesn't distinguish between whether somebody was a citizen or a non-citizen. There are certain privileges that people who were naturalized, and became citizens, there's certain rights and privileges they had, like the right to vote, that is not a natural right, but basically a right that comes from just being a human being, and that tradition has a long tradition based upon that was instilled and inherited by many people here, because the roots of it was basically the common law tradition dating back to the Magna Carta. So 400 years earlier, like in the 1500s, I guess, was the Magna Carta. But I could be wrong about the exact date. You might date better when the Magna Carta was signed, in the 1200, 1500, somewhere between there. Big range. But so I think for whatever reasons, and I think it's basically prejudices, many people think that people who came here uninvited, are not entitled to the same rights that people who came here, invited.
So this actually is complicated, and this is why. So when I described how any person in the U.S. has due process rights, there's some old cases dealing with people held at Ellis Island, for example, like in the 30s and 40s, who had not yet been admitted to the U.S. And the Supreme Court said that absolutely someone who has set foot in the U.S., has spent time in the U.S., That's a person that the due process clause applies to. And to physically remove that person from the U.S., you're detaining them, you're forcing them out. They have to get some kind of a hearing, some opportunity to contest it. But they said someone who hasn't yet crossed the border, who's not yet in the U.S., that's not a person in the United States yet. They're outside the jurisdiction. Even if Ellis Island is basically in the U.S., like they haven't crossed sort of customs, they haven't been admitted yet. And just turning someone away at the border is different. And the same due process rights don't attach. They did say that doesn't mean you have no rights. You can still have your habeas petition, reviewed. You still get some judicial review, but not of the same quality as if jurisdiction attached because of your physical presence in the U.S. Now that's like a very sort of like land, geography, physical sort of account of when due process attaches to people. Starting in the 90s, with some changes to immigration statutes, the statutes started to say, well, okay, but particularly if you're thinking about the southern border of the U.S., we may detain people who, if we had caught them at the border and reviewed their paperwork and they didn't have any, or they had no permission to enter the country, we would have turned them away at the border. But let's say we catch them like 10, 20 miles across the border, 50 miles across the border. That's the same thing as stopping them at the border. They're basically at the border. We just sort of miss them. But we should be able to use an expedited removal process and not go through the full process of holding on to this person, detaining them for a long time, giving them a hearing. We basically caught them effectively at the border. And what courts said in response, in what review occurred of that statutory change was, yeah, that's fine. That's basically at the border. That's basically a border stop. It's effectively at the border. It's effectively at a border checkpoint. That's okay. But there's been sort of like a mission creep over time where succeeding administrations sort of broadened it, said, well, how about like more like 100 miles from the border? And most recently under the new administration, although there was also expanded under the Biden administration, although it was expanded even more in the Trump 1 administration. But the most recent guidance it's not a change to the law, but it's sort of like a regulation, executive regulation that has said, we deem basically anyone detained anywhere in the U.S. as subject to expedited removal if they didn't enter the country legally. And that's almost like that's actually kind of like an exam question I would give in a habeas class or in a constitutional law class. Because wait a minute, the whole idea was that due process attaches to persons in the U.S. And the exception was like someone stopped at the border. But now it's been flipped. And the government has been saying for some time now that large categories of people who absolutely are physically present in the U.S. and maybe have been for some time. It's not like they just crossed the border yesterday and we just happened to catch them, but pretty close to the border. They're effectively at the border. This is people detained anywhere in the U.S. And the argument is like, oh, no, expedited removal can apply to all these people. No due process for them. That's a big, big change. It's being litigated in courts, several different courts around the country right now. And litigation can be slow. It's also sort of a frustration with due process. Like when you have hearings and you develop facts and develop a case, even if it involves rights that people care about or issues that people care about, you don't always get quick results. Anyway, several of the judges that have looked at this so far have suggested that this can't be constitutional. I mean, the due process clauses apply to all persons in the United States. The exception was just for the border. Now the border's been defined as everywhere. Is everywhere really a border? But we will see what happens. Eventually these cases will likely reach the Supreme Court, and we'll have a more final resolution of this. But this is a very big change from these old cases, which people thought were on shaky ground to begin with, where you're detaining someone in Ellis Island and saying, well, they're free to leave. Due process doesn't apply. Even then, there were dissents saying they're not free to leave. Like there's a funny line from Justice Jackson saying, like, if this person was an amphibian and they could swim back to Europe, maybe they would be free to leave. But this person is not free to leave. They're effectively being held by our government. Someone who's being held by our government, like due process should apply to that situation. So there had always been this concern that, wait a minute, if our government is detaining someone, who else can give them due process? Like, why would they be in a rights-free zone if we are actually holding them? But that's sort of a more functional view of due process. It's a little odd that that was a functional view of due process to try to give more due process rights to people being detained, arguably on the other side of the border. Now it's sort of a functional view of due process being used to say functionally no one should get due process. And so we will see what happens. This is a big issue, this expansion of expedited removal to kind of include the whole country. And we will see what happens in the courts over the course of, I don't know, this next year.
And again, talking about the fact is that really the end of civil society and the end of government is stated by Madison should be doing justice. The question is just really, what do we define as being fair and just? Another perspective I'd like to bring up with you, Brandon, is, it's generally considered that somebody who came across the border, without the proper documentation, did it only once, came here, stayed a while, maybe stayed for a protracted period of time, and never committed any other offense other than coming in uninvited. That's generally considered comparable to like a civil infraction. So we have a statute of limitations for misdemeanors that's kind of pretty short, right? 2 years, something like that. For other type of crimes, theft, robbery, something like that, the statute of limitations could be longer, and 3, 4, 5, 6 years, something like that. And so for every offense, for almost every offense, there's a statute of limitations. Even rape has a statute of limitations. So for most offenses, there's statute of limitations. We're picking people up. The U.S. government is picking people up who've been living in the country for 20 years, who basically their only crime that has committed, has been basically because they came uninvited, they've stayed, they've done nothing wrong since they've stayed, they've spent here, but there seems to be no statute of limitations associated with immigration policy. I don't know how any society can consider that, fair and just. We're basically saying a murderer, if you've committed murder and we don't catch you in a certain period of time, you got away with it. But if you came uninvited, there is no statute of limitations, and it doesn't matter the roots you've established here. We're going to kick you out, and ultimately that means kicking your family out, because if you have young kids, practically speaking, you don't want to see your kids in foster care, and they might be citizens. So you understand the consequences is really, and people are forfeiting their property and basically, whatever they've accumulated in their time here, just for that, civil infractions or other minor civil infractions, that have occurred. I've seen very little discussion about, not I've seen some conversation about the point about how the government has basically extended the border to basically make it the concept of the fact that there is no border, that they'll hunt you down wherever you are, and deport you, but basically do it no matter how long you've been here. Why do you think there's not any more conversations about why this should not be? Well, there are a couple of things. One is, why should this also not be subject to some sort of statute of limitations, that if you haven't found somebody who came here uninvited for a certain period of time, that they should get the same perks as somebody who's a murderer gets, and so it seems to me that this is grossly unfair. And also I think many people don't know, and maybe this is something you might want to elaborate on, is the fact is that one of the areas that the Trump administration tried to do is expedited procedures is through immigration courts. And immigration courts, unlike our other court systems, they report directly to the executive branch. They're not independent of the executive branch. And so basically the immigration courts are a system that do not have any sort of real checks and balances. And our system of government is designed to have a system with checks and balances, and so the immigration system is sort of exempt from that check and balance system. And
I guess people are surprised that I don't know if they're surprised, but that in immigration cases you don't have like a judge, like a local judge or a federal judge that's like exactly independent. And it's actually often been libertarians and conservatives that have been complaining over some time now, actually, that you have these executive branch administrative agencies that aren't really independent. and they often decide important things like, suspending executives, fining them for engaging in insider trading or fraud, and yet these executives don't get a regular court. It gets like an administrative court. And it's often been on the right that there have been concerns with having these administrative bodies act like judges, even though they're not in the judicial branch. They're controlled by the president. And at the same time, that's tended to be what happens in immigration cases, including because of changes, some of those same changes beginning in the 90s to the immigration statutes have really limited the ability of people who have immigration proceedings against them to get into a federal court, to get a more sort of independent judge to look at their case. And instead, there have been lots of stories and coverage for some time about how overburdened immigration judges are. They have enormous dockets and caseloads. They can't possibly sort of give a lot of time to the cases that they have. At different times, they've been given marching orders by administrations to just sort of process cases quickly. Because immigration matters are considered civil, you think, well, wait a minute, if the concern is that someone committed a crime, do we want them in this country? If someone was arrested for a crime in this country, whether they're a citizen or not, you go in front of a regular judge, and if you can't afford a lawyer, in a felony case at least, you're given a lawyer. So there's someone there to who knows the law, who can figure out, is this person legally being held? Was there probable cause? Are these real charges that they're being charged with? There's a lawyer there. And while due process doesn't entitle you to a lawyer in every circumstance, certainly if the charges are serious, it does. In immigration cases, even though the consequences can be really serious, it is considered civil. And so most people at these hearings, it's not just language barriers and the like. Immigration law is outrageously complicated. These codes are really complicated for me. I understand the judicial review parts, and I teach them when I teach habeas, but the rest of immigration law, I've never seen codes that are that complicated. I would never want to even consider giving someone immigration law advice. Plus, I'm not a practicing lawyer, so I don't give anyone advice. But even if I could, I would. I'm not an expert. In immigration cases, you don't have a lawyer. And so unless you can afford a lawyer, and very few can, you have these hearings which are not exactly in front of regular judges, and you don't have a lawyer. And that's in the lucky situations where it's not expedited removal and you actually get a hearing. Right. In many of these situations, they've expanded expedited removal, so you don't even get a hearing. Now, the Supreme Court last year did issue an important due process decision where I think many people heard about these flights to El Salvador, and people picked up in this country who were citizens of Venezuela were not being sent to Venezuela. They're being sent to this detention center in El Salvador. And the Supreme Court said that, no, you can't send people to another country who've been here without giving them due process. They need to have a meaningful opportunity to get in front of a judge and through habeas and say, you're not authorized to send me to this third country. These are the reasons. I'm entitled to be in the U.S. I have I'm a legal permanent resident, or I have immigration status, or I will be tortured if you send me there. And so it would violate international law to send me there. Lots of different things you might bring up. You have to have a chance to bring it up. You can't just tell a person in detention, okay, tomorrow you're getting on a plane. So that was a really important due process ruling from the Supreme Court last year.
And as I recall, that was unanimous.
Yeah, it was. You can't. It's a little bit like the same way they can't take your car because. We can't just say, we're deporting you because. And no, you don't get a hearing. No, you don't get a notice or explanation of what's happening. No, you don't get an impartial judge. We're just doing it. And that said, there are lots of different ways that things like that happen in this country. I talk about some really low-level ways that this can happen, and some ways in which technology is part of the issue. And so a lot of people get automated notices about different things. Some of it is just, sorry, you have to pay an extra fee for some online account or some streaming service or whatever. But it's very different if it actually affects something important to your lives. I describe lots of situations in which people who have one type or another of government health care, Medicaid, can get their benefits cut off for reasons that they don't understand because some automated system, picked up on a different address or something and said, "Ah, that's fraud. We're cutting them for fraud." And it's a little bit like saying this person, they're an illegal immigrant or they committed a crime. Well, this is fraud. Well, what is fraud? And maybe in general, people might say, yeah, like why should people who committed fraud get to take money from the government? Why should they be given lots of due process? We don't want people who've committed fraud to be taking our money and getting health care using that money. But what's fraud? And so a lot of these systems were designed to just sort of, if we uncover any discrepancy, if there's some other random database where we see a different spelling of the person's name or a different, spelling of their address, fraud, we suspend their account. And you can't just take away someone's healthcare again without giving them a notice and a chance to say, no, like that. I mean, there was a case in Tennessee where the person's mail was being sent to some horse pasture. Like, no, I don't live at the horse pasture. My address hasn't, in fact, not changed. Nothing has changed. So you should not be affecting my family's healthcare. But instead, a lot of these systems were very simply designed. It seems like a lot of them are not AI. They're just sort of like simple algorithms doing cross checks. But you particularly saw this last after the pandemic when all of a sudden Medicaid real eligibility could be determined again. They sort of didn't want to cut off people's health care during a global pandemic. But then a couple of years ago, when those restrictions lifted, some states were cutting tens and tens of thousands of people from the rolls. And the thing is, if they're eligible for Medicaid, then they'll just reapply. And it can actually be very expensive to do all the paperwork of terminating someone, and then they reapply, and they were always eligible, so then they reapply, and then they get it again. But in the meantime, they may have unpaid bills or ER visits and the like. And there'll be all this time that they'll spend trying to get those reimbursed. And maybe they'll get some reimbursed, maybe they won't. Or maybe they just will miss medication for a couple of months in the interim, which might mean that they end up having a very expensive ER visit because their health has worsened. Like these things are actually, due process violations can be really expensive. It's not good for a community to have people cycling in and out of healthcare, sometimes covered, sometimes not, because some algorithm or AI system is just sort of randomly cutting people off based on discrepancies that aren't real. And yet it's very easy for elected officials to say, we take fraud very seriously in our state, and we're going to make sure that no one engaging in fraud is going to get these benefits. So I talk about that. I talk about driver's license suspensions. Again, like low-level stuff. This isn't about deporting someone from the country or convicting someone of a felony crime. Nothing like that. We just finished some new analysis in North Carolina where there's about 800,000 people who've lost their licenses indefinitely. Like they don't know when they will get it back. They can't get their license back until they pay fines and fees. And many of them, the whole reason their license got suspended was that they couldn't pay the traffic ticket. But when they didn't pay the traffic ticket, then there are other fines and other fees. And then you didn't appear in traffic court, probably because you knew you couldn't pay. Well, there's actually another fee for that, a non-appearance fee. And so there could be thousands of dollars in debt coming out of some $75 ticket that the person couldn't pay. And if the person couldn't pay $75, they can't pay $2,000. And so then you have huge numbers of people that can never pay their debt to get these licenses back. And this isn't like debt because of they took out a loan and have been using a house. It's sort of like there's some debt that's like productive because we're taking out a loan to expand our business or to get a car and to finance it. This isn't like financing for something productive in society, right? This is an effort to really pressure people to pay their traffic tickets. This isn't about dangerous driving. And in most states, like you can obviously have your license suspended for driving, drunk or driving recklessly. But actually for the really dangerous driving situations, typically it's like your license is suspended for 3 months. Your license is suspended for 6 months. But no, you're poor and you can't afford the $75 ticket and you don't pay it. Your license is suspended indefinitely. It's huge numbers of people. It has huge impacts on the economy and on society. And often you can't do that to that many people without having a fairly automated process, which typically by definition means that people don't have due process rights. People aren't told, actually, like you can't have something this serious happen to you if you have no ability to pay. You really do have an opportunity. You should be able to request a hearing and say, I can't pay the $75. I also can't pay the $2,000 in fines that got tacked on. So work out a payment scale, fine, but can I restore my driving rights in the meantime? I shouldn't be driving illegally for years to try to come up with money that I just can't. But often people aren't told about those rights. Some of these systems have been struck down, but a lot of these people, like, these aren't the kind of people who are going to hire lawyers and bring due process cases to challenge it. So I talk about a lot of this, like, under the radar due process issues with smaller cases, but ones that affect a lot of people. And I don't want those to get lost, even though there's some very high profile. Obviously, hearing about someone who might get sent to a scary sounding prison in El Salvador is really salient. Really, high profile government officials who say, I've just been terminated from my job without any due process, no hearing. Where's my hearing? But I also want to talk about, like, local teachers who got fired from their government jobs without any hearing based on some algorithm, or people who are not detained for long periods of time. It's just $75 traffic tickets, but they lost their licenses, and that means a lot. People need to be able to legally drive for some jobs, and to not be in fear whenever you're driving around. You're not going to stop driving in most places, but you're going to be scared. So those are a lot of the issues that motivated me to write the book. And although there have been so many high-profile due process issues in the news, and they matter a lot, I also hope people still read the book to hear more about kind of like the regular, everyday due process concerns.
Yeah, well, I hope they do, because I hope people are concerned about justice and not vengeance, and a sense of proportionality. If we think about,
yeah, that's a big theme of the book too. I mean, I actually, we're sort of ending where I began in the book, which is I've surveyed 15, 16,000 people or so in the country in a whole series of experiments, and I ask people, and if you're listening to this podcast, like, this is the question. So, and it comes from, like, a famous statement by Sir William Blackstone, an English jurist whose work helped to inspire understanding of due process. But without saying what he said, and his famous quote, the question that we ask people in these surveys is, which type of error is the most serious to society? Convicting an innocent person, is that the most serious thing that could go wrong in a criminal case? Or failing to convict, acquitting a guilty person? Which one is worse? Or are they both equally serious? Or I don't know. But, most people don't say I don't know. Like, people have a sense of, like, which is worse. Sir William Blackstone, a lawyer, and most lawyers think this. Like he famously said, it's better that 10 guilty people go free than one innocent person be punished. Paraphrasing it basically, but like 10-1, Blackstone's ratio, it's like 10 times worse. He didn't really mean like it's like mathematically 10 times worse. He just meant like it's way worse. Our system is geared around giving the most due process rights to prevent wrongful convictions. That's why we have a beyond a reasonable doubt standard of proof in criminal cases. The stakes are so serious, it's liberty, that due process matters a lot, and we really want to avoid convicting the innocent. But most people don't answer it that way. Lawyers mostly answer it that way. That's how we're taught. And there are definitely some people who are like, are mostly worried about public safety. They're worried about crime in their community. They say that the worst thing is if guilty people are going free. And it's obviously not good. It's not good if guilty people go free.
Unless they're the ones accused.
Yeah. And so obviously people care most about due process. People feel it when it's themselves. But standing to the side like this, what most people say, though, is actually like, it's not like people don't care about due process, but they also care about public safety. And they say both errors are equally serious. They're both equally serious. And this isn't just their abstract view. When we ask them to be jurors, we measure like, how strong do you think the evidence is in this case? Would you convict this person? And across all these different types of scenarios, their views about these two types of errors really correspond with how they would vote if they were on a jury and deciding whether to convict. We actually just did a new study looking like, how you weigh these errors, does it affect whether you would call the police if you saw something, you're not sure if it's a crime, but you're trying to decide whether to call? Or would you make an eyewitness identification? Are you worried about, wrongly identifying someone who wasn't the person you saw commit the crime? Or are you worried about missing someone who's a criminal? Like, how people think about these errors affect how they approach that choice too. It also, we've asked people like, how you think about this? Does it affect like, how much do you want the government to spend on preventing wrongful convictions versus catching guilty people? And most people say, yeah, we want to split it like 50-50. But the good news is that people really do care a lot about due process, but they care about public safety too. And in my book, I really try to emphasize how it's not like a trade-off one versus the other. Like, these issues actually are connected, it's easy to see it as like sort of like a zero-sum game. If we focus on these poor innocent people, well, there are going to be a lot of seriously terrible, harmful, guilty people getting out. But actually, like if you convict an innocent person, by definition, if a crime really did happen, there's a guilty person out there. Like both bad things happen in that situation. That's why that error is so serious. That's why lawyers take it so seriously. And we've seen this time and time again, where actually, if you don't provide due process protections, you're going to get it wrong. You're going to have people who really aren't any danger to the public in jail. And that violates their rights, but it also means that you're not prioritizing the people who are really harmful. And so, like in my work in Houston, like when they had lots of misdemeanor arrestees in the jail, they had like 3,000 of them. These are people like who had speeding tickets and the like, mostly minor theft, homeless people arrested for trespass because they didn't have a legal place to live. A lot of these are minor cases. These are not the people who we should be prioritizing jail space for. Jail space is expensive. And we found that once the rules got changed and there was more due process provided at bail hearings, most misdemeanor people were not detained in the jail anymore, but crime went down. Misdemeanor reoffending went down. Misdemeanor offending went down too. Like you getting the balance, like due process is also about screening and making sure that we're actually, if we're going to take someone's liberty or property away, we're doing it to the right people. And it's counterproductive to seize people's cars for no reason or to put people in jail for no reason. It may feel good at the time. This is an emergency. We just got to do it. But it doesn't take that long, and it doesn't cost that much to provide due process. And actually, the cost of not doing it is really serious. And that's kind of like the final thing that I really wanted to try to emphasize in the book and in talking to you today. The due process doesn't cost much. It's when you hear like, oh, it'll take forever to actually figure out whether these people actually have permission to be in this country or not. Let's just send them out of the country. Or let's just arrest these people. Like, why should they get bail hearings? Like, what's that for? If they're dangerous, just arrest them. Well, that's actually really costly.
Yes, as Bastiat would refer to the seen and the unseen. So, or the law of unintended. What I like to refer to as the law of unintended consequences that you said so well. That if we have a system that results in a lot of innocent people being imprisoned, it means we have a lot of guilty people still out free, committing crimes. So we might have made ourselves feel better, but we haven't made ourselves safer by convicting, innocent people. So we would want to make sure that the people the better we are at convicting guilty people and not convicting innocent people, the more guilty people we catch, and that as opposed to guilty people that are still out free committing crimes, as you pointed out, and that's an issue of people don't really give sufficient consideration to. So that's the unseen part that Bastiat referred to, and also the issue when I refer to proportionality. I think about it this way is. And the point you made is that many people don't understand. People like talk about, oh, these people are murderers and rapists and whatever. You got to remember, these people are being removed through civil procedures, not criminal procedures. So they've not been adjudicated on their criminal procedures, because if they have and they've been found guilty, they're in jail. So, so many of them some of them might have allegations, but there's a decision to get rid of them over a civil procedure rather than a criminal procedure. And for many of these people, as we've seen the statistics, I think about 70% of them have never been convicted of a crime. So basically, we're taking a civil procedure and I consider it like a death penalty. Somebody commits a crime, you don't necessarily say crime, death penalty, crime, death penalty. One thing is catching somebody at the border, and before they've built a life here, send them back. The other is somebody who came uninvited, stayed, have been here 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, have paid taxes, have contributed to society. The only thing they've done wrong is come uninvited. The question is what's a proportional response to the crime they committed? And we are referring to these people as criminals and felons. So if they're only being considered through a civil procedure, then we can call everyone who's gone to traffic court, a criminal. So they're not. So they're only being adjudicated through a civil procedure, not a criminal procedure. So we shouldn't be calling criminals, which we are calling them criminals, and that's a false, phony label, because
Yeah,
we're,
it's sort of like a shell game, shifting these legal labels to kind of avoid due process. And we say that it's like, oh, well, we're detaining this person on the border, so they don't get due process rights. But then shifting the label, saying, well, we're sort of functionally treating them as on the other side of the border by calling it expedited removal, but they're not outside the border. Or saying, well, this may be this person we may be trying to do something to this person, like seize their car or deport them or fine them because of a criminal case, but this proceeding is civil. Like, this is a forfeiture. We're trying to take their property in a civil forfeiture. It's based on a crime, but it's civil. And so they don't get a lawyer and we don't have to follow the same standards. So there's lots of this like malleability, and, you know, like there's some attractive reasons why you want formality in law, like the category should matter, but not if the category is being used in ways that are designed to undermine rights that should really always apply. And so it's not wrong to think that due process should sometimes be flexible, like a full criminal trial with lawyers on both sides and a beyond a reasonable doubt standard of proof. Like, we don't need a full criminal trial if someone has a traffic ticket. Like, traffic courts are more informal. That's okay. Like, due process is a little bit of a sliding scale. But the concern is if really serious stuff is happening and just being labeled as something informal. That's really concerning. And so I've been pushing a more functionalist look at, like, what are the stakes really for people? What are the actual stakes? That should matter when we decide what due process rights they have. And these issues, will be litigated in the courts. They already are in lots of different settings. The Supreme Court has taken a real interest in this forfeiture stuff. It's civil, but it's like lots of property that matters to people is being taken using very informal procedures. Should we allow that? I mentioned the Supreme Court last year said due process, yes, that applies if someone's being removed from the country and isn't given any kind of a hearing. But we will see, soon. Well, how about if it's a government job that someone is like summarily removed from? Normally, that's due process too. That's it's like property. You can't just be fired because you have to have an opportunity to say, like, well, no, I've been performing well. Like, what rule did I violate? I'm a good employee. Why was I fired? Same thing if it's technology, saying, the algorithm says you committed fraud, or the algorithm says you're a subpar employee, or the algorithm says we saw your face at the crime scene. How is this AI? How is this algorithm developed? Is it accurate? What's our chance to contest it? Those issues are going to be bigger and bigger because AI is being rolled out everywhere, and it makes decisions really quickly. I'm not saying that humans make unbiased decisions, but due process, there's sort of established due process ground rules for how you challenge a judge that you say made a hasty decision. Well, how do you challenge the AI that made a hasty decision? There's a real need for that as the government rolls out more AI.
I think that I saw on X. I saw some police superintendent. I don't know exactly what's, and he was talking with some degree of outrage, as I think it deserved to be, and that he mentioned the fact that he had 8 members of his police force detained, while they were not wearing their uniform, and they were stopped, and the policemen themselves felt that they were harassed. Again, these are people who were out of uniform, and they were temporarily detained for not having an adequate proof of citizenship. So by ICE agents. So the police chief, gave I guess a press conference and expressed his outrage about this. And he also pointed out the fact that all 8 of the people that were stopped were Black. So in spite of the fact that people say there's no profiling going on, there is profiling going on. I guess a lot of people who are not subject to the profiling are okay with other people being profiled as long as it's not them. I guess if they don't seem.
That's another. There's a separate protections against discrimination in this country under the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, making sure that people aren't treated unequally. But a fair process also protects against that kind of bias, whether it's racial bias or bias against people because they're poor or disfavored for other reasons, religion, ethnicity, whatever it is. If there's a fair process, it's a lot. If someone can just do something just because and not have to explain themselves, that's a lot more ripe for bias in any kind of situation. And it may not even be conscious bias, but if you don't have to explain yourselves, if you don't have to provide a reason, you're just doing it based on your gut, like that's not what we want government officials to be able to do. And if they don't have to provide a reason, if they don't have to explain themselves in front of a judicial officer, there's just going to be a lot more opportunity for discrimination and for bias. And so procedural due process may just be about the fair process, but it also provides a really important protection against other kinds of dangers, including discrimination. And you see that in all kinds of different spaces. Even in the turning from high profile immigration issues in the country right now back to the kind of low level, not that interesting misdemeanor cases I was mentioning in Texas. For misdemeanor bail, when they didn't have due process at bail hearings, people didn't have lawyers, a far greater percentage of Black defendants charged with these low level misdemeanors ended up in the jail. And almost immediately when they changed the rules and said, no, we're providing due process protections now. Everyone gets a public defender at the bail hearing. You have a chance to explain, does this person really pose a public safety threat because of their, arrest for driving with a suspended license or not? That race disparity disappeared, just completely disappeared. And it was good for public safety too. Misdemeanor rearrests also went down. But so racial disparities disappeared. It was a huge cost saving for the county because you didn't have all these low-level people being held at great expense in the jail. And it was good for public safety. It was like a win in every direction. So that's kind of I wish more often we would pause, look at the data, look what happens when you actually protect due process rights. It's really good for people. Really good for the government, too. The government saved a ton of money. It was good for public safety. It actually costs very little to give people public defenders at hearings like this. People may figure giving everyone a lawyer, that's going to cost a fortune. Actually, what costs a fortune is having thousands of people in a jail for low-level crimes. Jail time is expensive. Public defenders, cheap. Anyway, I should probably log off soon. I need to head to some other meetings. But
okay, well then I
feel like in an hour we still barely scratch the surface. There's so many different types of due process cases being brought in the country now.
Well, are there any things that you'd like to, before you have to go off to your meetings? Any other things that you would like to, that you haven't mentioned yet, that you think is important to mention now, in the remaining minutes that you have available to speak to the audience?
I think I've talked a couple times about technology issues. I'll just mention that there have been a couple of states, in particular New York and California, that have passed some new AI regulations since I wrote the book. And one of them in New York, at least for now, they're talking about amending it, says that AI systems that affect people in big ways, including people's rights, there needs to be some testing to find out how reliable they are, independent testing. I think that's hugely important, especially for government. If government is going to be using, whether it's facial recognition or some fraud detection system, whatever it is, we need to know it's reliable and that it's not going to deprive people of their rights unfairly. And we should be given notice and a chance to respond. People have been furious when you have these automated red light cameras, and if it's sending you a ticket and you don't have a chance to respond to that ticket, even if we figure, okay, those red light cameras might be more accurate than a police officer who says you ran the red, and you're like, no, I didn't. But more and more, there's going to be the equivalent of the red light cameras, where these automated systems are being used by the government to do things that might result in us being fined, maybe even jailed. And there need to be ground rules. Regulation has been really slow in this country. In Europe, they have this AI Act, which is this big, broad framework that says high-risk AI, absolutely, you can't be doing that to affect people's rights, and there need to be regulations. But the process of writing those regulations is lengthy. And so we actually may catch up in the U.S. if we start thinking about what AI guardrails there need to be. But a lot of the conversation has just focused on innovation and technology, and some privacy issues, which are important. In the book, I really want to highlight that due process issues matter too. If the government is using this stuff, and you think the government should lead by example, okay, maybe industry can do whatever it wants. They can treat you unfairly and give you like bad recommendations for what to buy on Amazon or Netflix or whatever. That's fine. That's consumer stuff. And if you don't like it, then you can buy stuff elsewhere, or pick a different streaming platform, or pick a different, social media platform. If you feel like your content is being moderated unfairly, or you're being recommended, products that you don't really want, and they're doing things with your data that you don't like. You're a consumer. Maybe if there's an alternative, you can move to it, although sometimes there aren't great alternatives. But we know that there's one monopoly that you can't get around, and that's the government. And so if the government wants to accuse you of things and take things from you, it's especially important that they do it in a fair way. And black box AI cannot be fair. By definition, it doesn't tell you what it's doing. And so the main tech thought that I wanted to end on is that just like we don't want a government official that says, I'm arresting you just because, and I'm not going to explain myself. Same thing with AI. We can't be allowing the government to say, oh, I'm a very thoughtful public official, but I'm relying on AI. That's a black box. The AI says to arrest you just because. And I'm sure it's developed by the smartest people, and so I'm sure it's good. Like that's the same problem. The government official might as well be saying, I'm arresting you because. You can't just outsource their decision to AI. They have to be able to explain why you did something that entitles them to arrest you, and you have to be able to, at a hearing, say, like, no, like that's false. I don't have this prior conviction, whatever it is. The AI is wrong, or it's based it on faulty data, someone else with my name, that's not me. You have to have the chance to make that argument. And you can't do it by definition if it's a black box AI program. The government should be leading by example, even if it takes a long time to figure out what are the regulations that are right for private industry. The considerations are different if the government is using it. And we don't have that in this country. We had guidelines towards the very end of the Biden administration on government procurement, federal government procurement of AI, that they had to do these audits to make sure people's rights were being protected, including due process rights. But they never took effect, and they haven't been renewed. So we need those protections, and we don't have them. So I wanted to end with that.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I'm going to end with this. I'm going to end very briefly so you can go to your meetings and whatever else you have to do the rest of the day. So for all people who are watching, and I strongly recommend Brandon's book, Defending Due Process. What I will do is, as my expression appreciation for Brandon coming onto the show, that if you write Johnny at JONNY at bitshoot.com. So again, that's JONNY at bitshoot.com. The first 10 people that write in will be gifted a Kindle version of Brandon's book. My appreciation for him coming on to spread his book, and that I will pay for 10 of them. And so you'll get a few pennies of royalties of that. But more,
I'm just grateful to anyone who takes the time to read any book these days. There are lots of forms of media, lots of things to stream, but there's something really special about focusing on some words and some ideas and having a conversation. And whether you read the book or listen to the book, I'm really grateful for any of your time, and really grateful for your time in reading my book and talking to me about it.
It's my pleasure. And so please write into Johnny, say, I want to know more about due process. I'd love to read Brandon's book, and we'll send off to you the first 10 people that do that. We'll send off to you. If you give us your email, we'll send you to Johnny. We'll send you the Kindle version, just to make my life easier. So thank you again, Brandon. Have a great day, and I really enjoyed this conversation very much, and listening to you, very, very insightful for me, as your book was. So
thank you
so much. Bye.